they're all having in the White House to put up their grown-on pants for the first time since they took power again. This is a real war. It's very possible that it could spiral way beyond the pathway of missiles and drones between Israel and Iran to throughout the Middle East. And I think you saw that a bit in Mr. Trump's hesitation about 24 hours ago, where he said, "I may or may not." I don't think they can decide. They can decide what to do here.
It's interesting, though, that President Putin has also tried to position himself as some kind of mediator in the Israel war. And when he did, Trump just kind of slapped him down and said, mediate Russia first. You can worry about this later. I mean, what does that actually say? I mean, do you think that Ukraine has considerably slipped down Trump's priority list for the moment?
Well, yes, but on the other hand, this is a unhinged president with a very short attention span, and I think they're all having in the White House to put up their grown-on pants for the first time since they took power again. This is a real war. It's very possible that it could spiral way beyond the pathway of missiles and drones between Israel and Iran to throughout the Middle East. And I think you saw that a bit in Mr. Trump's hesitation about 24 hours ago, where he said, "I may or may not." I don't think they can decide. They can decide what to do here. So as for Russia, I think we're reminded that they're actually a small power at the end of the day. Yes, they may want to offer to mediate or whatever, but no one takes them seriously on that one. If anyone's going to mediate, who knows? Maybe it could be a Saudi Arabia, which is playing a much bigger diplomatic presence in the region. They were, after all, it's hard to believe, isn't it, that they were on the verge of normalization of ties with Israel before Hamas attacked. And they did, I think, have some warming of ties with Iran. So let's see who gets in the middle. But I don't expect, if we're looking for peace, for it to come via the good offices of Mr. Trump.
And we are talking just after a day's national mourning in Ukraine after this horrific 9-hour aerial bombardment of Kyiv. On that very same day, though, later on, President Putin had this kind of round table with journalists saying he wanted to end the war as soon as possible and is ready to continue negotiations provided Kyiv and Western allies are willing to engage. I mean, that's just blatantly shoving it in people's faces, isn't it?
It is, and he should have completed the sentence, "I want to end the war, but only on my maximalist terms." So just quickly, because I know I've said it before on Frontline, the big ones, of course, are entire control of the 4 oblasts that Russia partially controls, Ukraine giving up its bid for NATO, possibly even the EU, international recognition of Crimea, reduction of Ukraine's armed forces capability, and also a very, very big one is Ukraine has to give up its bid for reparations. That brings up the question of Russian frozen assets. Maybe we'll have time for that. But no, he's clearly putting forth terms that no Ukrainian president could ever agree to. But he's also pounding the living daylights out of Ukraine. It isn't only those missiles and drones that, as you referenced, really hit Kiev, but also what they're doing closer to Kharkiv and Sumy, creating these so-called buffer zones. And there's when I was in Kiev recently, I had a briefing on a possible, or rather a likely, intensive Russian summer offensive. We're talking about the front line possibly shifting as much as 60 kilometers, Kate, and also that could trigger an outflow of people from that area of upwards of 250,000 people. Who's going to look after them? Ukrainian capabilities here are already very saturated. If that does happen, European states have to get ready. I was at a briefing of ambassadors in Kiev, and I told them, you guys have to start telling your capitals that this is what you face if Mr. Putin is going to push the front line that much further.
And are you seeing any signs at the moment of a potential summer offensive?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The buildup in the northern part of the country, close to Sumy and Kharkiv also being very, very, very heavily hit. And there are very worrisome shifts in the front line. We're not talking many kilometers, but we are talking closer towards strategic cities where Russia could go even further. It is not looking good. And remember that I don't want to jump ahead of any of your questions, but the G7, Mr. Zelensky was in my home province of Alberta in Canada, and he basically left empty-handed. Those guys couldn't even agree on a unified statement on Ukraine. I suspect he came back in a not a very good mood with that happening.
And in those attacks on Kyiv, stunningly, awfully, cluster bombs were used. And it seems to prove this point that whatever Putin says, he does exactly what he wants and quite openly does it and gets away with it. And to refer to the G7, in a way, there's nothing to stop him when you have people like the US president saying it was a mistake to throw Russia out of the G7, well, now G7. And that was actually done because they had annexed Crimea. So he's almost rewarding bad behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the cluster munitions. Not the first time, though. I believe it was in Zaporizhia and elsewhere, a few other cities in the east where they found them as well. Of course, these are very, very damaging. And in certain types of cluster munitions, they distribute, disperse rather little bomblets. And we've seen in other parts of the world where kids pick them up thinking they're toys, devastating consequences. Yeah, the G7, very interesting. Trump shows up, the big man on the block, and then he leaves only just after just one day, suggesting that maybe it's time to allow Russia back in to make it into the G8. But that would be rewarding, Mr. Putin. But as I said to one of your journalist colleagues the other day in London, I don't think Mr. Putin is interested in that. He's actually, I think, pulling away from these Western multilateral fora or institutions. He's much more comfortable in clubs like the BRICS bloc of nations, which of course includes China, Brazil, India. It's a growing club. I think he would actually say thanks, but no thanks if that were to happen. But I think what was more important there is what Mr. Trump said or didn't say. And I think it was a continuation, Kate, of let the two, Russia and Ukraine, fight it out, and then let's see what happened. And yeah, indicating that almost Ukraine is to blame for this again. It's unbelievable.
You are just back from Georgia, a former Soviet state, 20% of which is occupied by Russia, and which appears to be turning away from the EU now and towards the Kremlin since the parliamentary elections last year. What is the situation in the country now?
Well, first of all, I got to say it was very eerie sitting in Tbilisi because locals reminded me, Michael, you're not very far from where Russian tanks are parked and Russian bases. It ranges, I don't know if anyone knows for sure, from 40 kilometers from Tbilisi to more accurately, probably a 2 hour drive, but nonetheless, they're very, very close. And what is happening is the footprint is expanding. And it was very interesting to hear from one of the more prominent young Georgian activists who actually showed us video and photographs of the so-called front line. And some of them are just painted sticks. Why isn't there any barbed wire and other scary stuff there? She explained, well, because they can move the sticks very easily without anybody noticing. But it's not only what matters to what the naked eye sees; it's also what's happening beneath the surface, and that, Kate, is very, very chilling. On my last night, I spent quite a bit of time talking to the brother of an activist who was just handed down a ridiculous court sentence for attending a demonstration, not really provoking the police. But this is what they do: is on flimsy, mostly trumped up charges. They grab people from the protests, from the streets, and lock them away. The courts are giving harsh sentences, but you really feel the determination to stand up to the so-called Dream Party, which is the pro-Russian ruling party. When I was there, they hit the 200-day mark in consecutive nights of protests in front of the parliament. And this is a wide swath of society, from bankers to students to uh, web designers, all sorts of people, because they know very well what faces them if they don't oppose what's going on there. But the Dream Party is also taking pages right out of the Russian playbook in terms of, for example, branding foreign organizations, or rather NGOs, as foreign influenced, and outlawing them. There's been a chill over the media as well. So it is not looking good. Let's remind everyone that it was in 2008 that this invasion happened, and that was kind of the starting pistol for what was to follow here in Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022, where Russia invaded. There was very little response, even from the EU. I believe it was Mr. Obama who was in power. Very few sanctions. And now, one final thought on this. The EU, I believe, is going to consider visa restrictions on Georgia, because right now they have visa-free travel. And they want to do that to, as it was explained to me, to punish the folks in power, but also to push the general population to oppose even more, saying, see, these are the consequences of what your government is doing. But I'm not so sure that's a good route to take, because that's going to cut off a lot of young people, for instance, from very, opportunities that they want to pursue elsewhere in Europe. So that has to be handled very carefully. But again, very little media attention, and I'm glad you asked me about it, because I think we have to keep a very close eye on what's happening there.